votes.
Thank you. Okay, we move on to the workshop that we've been waiting for a long time right now. It's an update from this, oh no, wait a second here. Item number 13, mobile home park short form. Process, history, and on Proposition K. I just wanted to clarify that this workshop is to increase awareness about the Proposition K, about the short form. We have a very little time to discuss these issues on a short form hearings. So this is an informational process and to improve the understanding on these issues, but certainly not a debate on the merit of Proposition K. Any changes to Proposition K has to go to the voters because it has been approved by the voters. So we would like to use these opportunities to learn more about Proposition K in short form.
Mayor Abed and council members, I'll kick it off. I've worked with Ronnie and Michelle to put together a little bit of background for you on mobile home rent control. It's hard for some of us that have been around the city for a while to realize that it's been, what, now 20-some years since Proposition K was passed. It was a big deal when it passed. Implementing it was a very difficult process for the city, as you'll see when we talk about some of the cases. But we thought we'd run through a little bit of the history, some of the issues with Prop K and long form, talk a little bit about short form, and then Michelle will talk about the process with you. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to just jump right in and interrupt, and we'll try and answer them. And then when we're done, I know the residents some of them have prepared a presentation. There may be some park owners here that want to speak as well, and I know council wants to give everybody a shot. One of the things I always like to start off, and it's in your mobile home history document, which is on the city's website, which I think is real important, is to understand the history and the context of mobile homes. It's a very rich history, actually. As we pointed out in our brief to the United States Supreme Court, the original mobile homes are what we would commonly refer to today as travel trailers. And they were often homemade, a few hundred square feet, could be moved easily. And that history is worth remembering because, as you'll see shortly, that's no longer the case. Go ahead, Michelle. They went through a transition. You can see there a couple of camper trailers. We picked these slides because you can see now we have the modern RV, some of which are very, very nice. But you see those kinds of structures, but then move forward, you can see the transition a little bit. I had to select this one. I actually spent my first few years in a mobile home, and so that's a picture of me and my dog. I finally found a reason to get that picture out and use it. But you can see the coaches became more permanent. There's a bit of an evolution there. And then, Michelle, if you want to go on to the, by about the 1950s, they transformed even more, eventually becoming large sectionalized homes, which could usually only be moved by not just one truck now, but two trucks. And in the next slide, you can see now that mobile homes, that name mobile, as the U.S. Supreme Court pointed out, is not really accurate any longer. These are actually very, very nice homes. And I would say that probably a lot of the homes in a lot of these parks are maybe nicer, much nicer than some of the stick-built homes. Next slide. So as you can see, they've become a form of immobile prefabricated housing. And again, that's important in understanding rent control because with some exceptions, which I'll talk about, these folks now, they own this structure, their home, and yet it's sitting on someone else's land. And when you stop to think about that, that's an unusual situation. If anybody owns a rental, you usually own the structure, the house, and the land. Here, these folks have their home, but it's sitting on someone else's land. And you can start to see the dynamic that might lead some otherwise fairly conservative communities to look at mobile home rent control. The trend towards the immobility and the permanence has also coincided with a desire to improve a lot of the parks. As you know, Escondido has some very, very nice mobile home parks. They've evolved from small unplanned facilities to larger design communities. They have amenities, as you remember from some of your proceedings, where there's clubhouses, swimming pool, landscaping, and even social programs at some of these parks. I want to go through the park ownership structure with you a little bit because it's different depending on the parks and even within the parks. Most parks are your typical rental park. They're owned by an individual or a group of investors. And in that case, the owner of the land rents the space out. The mobile home owner places his coach on the land, and then in exchange for the space rent, the park owner maintains common areas and amenities. So the homeowner is responsible for the coach itself. The park owner is responsible for everything else. There's also some parks in the community that are resident-owned, and those are held by the residents in a variety of ownership structures. It might be a condominium type of thing. It might be a housing cooperative or something like that. There, the owner of the mobile home generally owns a fee simple share interest in the park. The owners of all share equally in the ownership and use of the common areas. They all pay a monthly fee for the upkeep and maintenance. And you've heard testimony at some of your hearings about, well, in our park, it only costs us this. That's a resident-owned park, so they obviously don't have the profit-making or ownership issue other than the ownership of their share. Very similar to a homeowners association. There's a third type of ownership structure which we've seen evolve in this city in response to rent control, and that's a situation where the park owner not only owns the space, but they've also acquired the mobile home. Tenant wants to move out, the coach owner leaves, and the park owner will actually acquire the mobile home. The reason that's important is because our rent control ordinance only regulates the space. It does not regulate the rental of the coach. It's very clear on that. That effectively means that that space is out from under rent control. And you can see the dynamic there. An individual lives in that situation, they become unhappy with the park or the amount of the rent, they can simply pick up and leave. Whereas if you have somebody that owns the coach, they don't have that luxury because, number one, it's difficult to find spaces in parks, and number two, it's both difficult and expensive to move the mobile homes. And so that puts them in a different situation. As of 2007, we had approximately 315 spaces in the city that were occupied by mobile homes that actually belonged to the park owner. And as I mentioned before, the coach ownership and the difficulty in moving space availability are no longer an issue, and that particular rental unit does become very similar to an apartment. In terms of rental structures in the park, you have a couple of issues there. You usually have a short-term lease, that's your month-to-month lease. Under California state law, that is subject to rent control. And then you have long-term leases, which are exempt from rent control. Also want to take just a minute here and talk about vacancy control and decontrol. You hear those terms a lot. Vacancy control is basically where the rent is set on a space. Let's say it's $300 a month. Let's say the owner of the coach sells to someone, moves out of state. The new incoming tenant still pays the $300 a month space rent. That's where the rent is controlled even though there's a vacancy or a change in the tenants. Vacancy decontrol, however, if that individual sells, moves out of state for some reason, the incoming tenant, the purchaser of that coach, will then has their rent set at whatever the market rate is. The park owner can set the rent. So you'll often see a space that's maybe at $300 under rent control, changes owners of the coach, and the park owner decides to raise the rent to say $400 or $500, maybe even higher. I think park owners will probably testify to you that this is an important economic relief valve for them. You may hear arguments from tenants, though, that the problem with that is if a prospective buyer of their coach comes in and the rent's going to be raised a lot, it's more difficult for them to market their coach. So those are some of the dynamics you'll hear from folks. Escondido's ordinance, when it was adopted, we assumed for a number of years that ours was a vacancy control ordinance, and we took that position in litigation. The park owners applied the ordinance that way. But in 1996, in a case called Thompson versus City of Escondido, the California Court of Appeal for the 4th District interpreted the city's ordinance and held that it was not a vacancy control ordinance and that it did not regulate the rent that could be charged to prospective tenants. And therefore, we effectively have a vacancy decontrol ordinance per interpretation of the court. Now, because we have an initiative measure, that can only be amended by another initiative, a vote of the people. So 2 different times, the residents requested of the council, and there were measures put on the ballot, Proposition O in 1996, Proposition T in 1998, to impose vacancy control in our ordinance, and both of those failed. So that's currently our ordinance is a vacancy decontrol ordinance. You may have seen news stories about Oceanside. Matter of fact, I gave their city attorney some information today. Their council is debating whether or not to amend their ordinance. They can because it's a council ordinance, and move it from vacancy control to vacancy decontrol, similar to Escondido's. So next slide. Long-term lease regulation, my hope would be that chapter of our history is over. That was a very, very difficult situation. as rent control was adopted in this community, the residents in the city realized that a lot of park owners were, for lack of a better word, forcing tenants into long-term leases. The council engaged in an effort to regulate that practice, not only by requiring advance approval of leases, but also by regulating the process by which leases were offered, requiring certain warning or cautionary language in leases. That was challenged. There was state legislation both ways that forbade the practice and then allowed the practice. Eventually, the court stepped in, and in the Mobile Park West case, determined that Escondido was preempted by state law from regulating long-term leases. And the state law we were preempted by was the mobile home residency law. That's an important law because as these parks became more permanent, more people lived in them, the state legislature saw a need to step in and address park living conditions. You may have heard residents testify before you about things that go on in parks are illegal according to the mobile home residency law, and that's a state regulation that controls some of the things that go on in parks. And we were determined to be preempted from regulating long-term leases, and so we don't get in that business anymore. Mobile home parks in Escondido, the demographics, I think, have changed quite a bit over the years. As you can see, in 1988, there were 29 mobile home parks. Some were closed and replaced with permanent housing projects. I think that was generally a good thing for the community. If the council remembers, a lot of those parks were fairly old, very run down, not necessarily the best living conditions. The total number of spaces, and this is total number of mobile home spaces, went from 3,600 in 88 to down to 3,405 in 2007. So we've actually lost total mobile home spaces. And then, Michelle, you want to go to the next slide? In 1988, you can see we had 29 parks. By 2007, down to 24 parks, 3,600 spaces down to 3,405 spaces. This is an interesting slide, or number. The next one is 1990, we had 2,700 spaces under rent control, but by 2010, we only anticipate there's 1,657 spaces under rent control. And that, of course, is a result of park owners buying the coach. It's a result of long-term leases, and I think maybe some vacancy decontrol as well. So. Changing demographics, more parks are requiring residents to sign a long-term lease, more spaces owned by the park owner, resident conversions, more family parks. I think we've seen that. I don't know if we have any numbers. Michelle can mention that when she speaks, but when I first started with the city and there was mobile home rent control, a lot of the parks were seniors only, and I think we've seen more family parks, and that, of course, raises new issues in terms of amenities and playgrounds and that sort of thing. We have now, I think, a wide diversity. We've got small, older, single-wide trailers or coaches to newer, triple-wide manufactured homes. Rents range from a low of $200 to over $1,100 when both the coach and the space are rented. So. Proposition K, as you know, was adopted in June of 1988. As I pointed out earlier, and this is a very important fact for Escondido, initiatives can only be amended by a subsequent initiative, not by the City Council. Now, it's very important when it comes to talking about short form, because we can't just step in and amend Prop K to do things differently, whether the park owners want it or the residents want it. Our hands are tied, and you'll see how short form evolved from that type of restriction. As I mentioned before, there's been 2 attempts to amend Prop K. Both were unsuccessful. Under Proposition K, if a park owner wants to increase the rent, this is a typical what we call a long-form process. They have to obtain approval from the board, and that's you. Some cities have a separate board. In this case, the residents of the city saw fit to make the City Council the Rent Review Board. There's an application required. There has to be a public hearing. It has to be within 60 days of the application. The board has to apply various factors and then shall determine such rent increase as it determines to be just, fair, and reasonable. And there's 11 factors in the ordinance ranging from CPI, comparable parks, and then there's a catch-all factor, which is any other that the board determines to consider. Our ordinance has been the subject of extensive litigation. At one point in time, we had, if you can imagine this, 41 mobile home cases pending in either California state courts or in the federal court system. In December of '88, just a few months after Prop K was passed, the first of the Yee cases was filed, and they claimed that Prop K constituted taking under the state and federal constitutions. Next slide, Michelle. The Yee Hall cases were ultimately consolidated. In 1991, the Supreme Court issued its landmark decision, Yee versus City of Escondido. Interestingly, what started out as a mobile home case quickly became a land use case, drew a lot of attention nationwide, and the unanimous decision authored by Sandra Day O'Connor upheld Proposition K and said it did not result in a taking. In recent years, the litigation hasn't so much challenged Prop K on takings grounds, but for a period of years the city had a lot of lawsuits challenging the amount of the increase. In other words, directly attacking the city council's decision and the rationale for its decisions. Next slide, Michelle. And before I go to the key events, let me just comment on that. The courts have repeatedly said that they don't so much look at what the formula the city uses, they look at the result. Did the park owner get a fair return on the investment? Were they able to maintain their rate of return? And when you start to read the mobile home cases, there are dozens of theories used to calculate, or formulas used to calculate rent increases. So you can, it's a question of whether or not the number's right. But does that mean you just throw darts at a dartboard to pick the right rent increase amount? Well, not really, because when the court scrutinizes to determine whether or not the amount's right, they're going to look very closely at how you made your decision and the rationale behind your decision. And so those are some of the legal issues that you can see. Dip your toe into that water, it can be a real mess. So keep that in mind when you think about short form versus long form. In long form, you can have a lot of potential pitfalls there. So key events, just remember 78, the mobile home residency law was enacted. 1988, Prop K was adopted, upheld in 1992. Short form then was adopted in 1997. Long form application, those became known as long forms. I just talked about the formulas and the legal requirements. There's a few positives to long form, and by the way, the residents of the park owners may want to elaborate on some of these positives or negatives and have differing perspectives, but a few of the positives, first of all, very detailed disclosure required of the park owners. Generally, residents like that. They like a lot of information. The park owner has to open their books. So there's very detailed disclosure. There's a lot more information for the board to consider. That can be good or bad depending on your perspective, but there usually is a great deal more information. Certainly long form is provided for by Prop K. That's what's set out in Proposition K. And there's more factors to consider. You have to consider all of the 11 factors in the ordinance, although the council gets to decide how much you want to weigh each one. You may accord zero or very little value to one of the factors, more to another one. You can do that differently from case to case. That's your discretion as a body. But you do have to look at the 11 factors. A few negatives. They're very expensive to put together. They're very burdensome when it comes to putting together an application. They're expensive to analyze. At one point, when the city was being challenged on the amount to justify the council's decisions, particularly when a case was sent back for reconsideration, the city was hiring several consultants, probably running $10,000 or $12,000 an application to analyze those. And so that was one of the issues facing the council. They result in much information, which can be a positive and a negative. The city requested a lot of information from some of the park owners. Lengthy hearings. It was not uncommon to have hearings continued a number of times, and very difficult hearings. We would actually have hearings where after lengthy testimony, the council would sit silently, unable to know where to start or where to make a decision. Let's see, I think I've covered most of this. We had an application fee, more paperwork. Usually under longer form, we saw longer periods of consideration, and historically larger rent increases were asked for, and often larger rent increases were given. Short form overview then. The council adopted the short form application process in December of 1997. That was the cap of a joint park owner resident group that got together and worked on this. Short form hearings are popular with park owners because certain fees are waived. There's less administrative burden with the process. They generally produce smaller rent increases. The adjustments occur more frequently. It does avoid large increases all at once for some of the residents. My third bullet was a little bit controversial with some of the residents that I worked with in preparing this. I described the short form as having a goal of consensus and approval. They remind me correctly that that doesn't necessarily abdicate the board from doing its job. And you do need to act responsibly and consider all the evidence whether you're under short form or long form. But the whole idea of short form was to avoid all the negatives of long form, I think generally speaking. And those that were involved in the process can share a great deal about that. In the short form, to do respect for Prop K and honor the law, we had to make the form both voluntary and also consistent with Prop K. Otherwise, the city was subject to a lawsuit that we had altered Prop K without going back to a vote of the people. So what the council elected to do was, of those 11 factors, they said, well, we have to consider the 11 factors under Prop K. We'll focus on the CPI. And that's why you see CPIs coming out of the short form as the primary factor, is because they chose, which legally they can do, one of the factors to put most emphasis on. The other thing about short form is you know that the park owner can reject the result under short form and file a long form application if they're dissatisfied. That's the voluntary part. Short form has only been tested once in court, but when the process was outlined to the trial court, they upheld the process and said it did not violate or do any injustice to Prop K. I think with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle and have her walk you through the short form process. Yes.
Just for clarification, the last point you made, the previous slide, just clarify the decision that the board has to make on a short form and how it relates to the 11 points with the return on investment and everything else. How would that relate and integrate with the 11 points when we're considering the short form versus the long form?
In a short form process, the original objective was to only focus on the CPI factor. So if council were inclined to look at the park owner's rate of return or comparable parks or any of the other 11 factors, you're probably better advised to deny the short form application and have the park owner go through the long form process. Short form, again, is a voluntary alternative to Prop K. And the CPI, the 75% of the CPI, that was an issue that was debated a great deal at the task force. Technically, your language says up to 75% of the CPI. The park owners have generally argued, as one would expect, well, that's 75% of the CPI. The residents, though, and you will hear this from them frequently, what's up to 75%, the council could grant less. You could grant less, and then it would be up to the park owner to decide whether or not they wanted to reject that and go through the long form process.
Is there an example ever of a short form rent increase that resulted in less than 75%?
There have, Michelle might, yeah, I know we've had some. And I think we may have had some where the park owner went in and said, okay, I'll take less. And then there may have been some where the park owner said, no, I'm going for long form.
Well, I know I was here for one where the park owner voluntarily arrived at a number with the park residents, but has the council ever made a decision
Yes.
to grant less than?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I want to hear about that
Okay.
at some point.
Okay.
Michelle.
So, Michelle.
And just to give you some numbers, of the 24 parks in the city of Escondido, 9 are senior parks, 15 are all-age parks. There are 5 parks that are resident-owned, meaning the owners of the home also own the property, and there are 19 that would be rental parks, and those would be the parks that would come before the board for rent increase under the short form or long form application. When the short form was established in 1997, it was determined that a park owner could submit an application on an annual basis. If the park owner chose not to do that, then the park owner could not submit an application that had a period of consideration for more than 2 years. And the thought process there was, if the park comes in on a regular basis, the increases are going to be incrementally smaller than if they wait 4 or 5 years or they come in under a long form application. There is no application fee or cost associated with the short form application as far as a park owner, and they are also exempt from an annual administration fee of $40 per space per year when they apply under the short form and receive an increase. Although the short form guidelines do not require that staff hold a resident meeting while processing the short form application, we have found it to be a good practice because it gives the park owner, the park owner's representative, the resident representative, management company, management staff, gives them a chance to sit down and talk about their issues, go over any concerns that they might have, and it also gives staff a chance to answer questions regarding the short form process. This is also the time that the resident representative and the park owner's representative are advised that the board strongly recommends that they meet and attempt to resolve their issues at least 21 days prior to the hearing date. And a document to this effect is signed by both representatives, and it's placed in the park file. In the staff report, the calculation of the rent increase is based solely on the change in the consumer price index and no other factors. According to the short form guidelines, the residents are to be given a 30-day notice prior to the hearing before the board. Ideally, we send a notice out about 40 days before. That gives the residents a little advance notice on the resident meeting and gives them more than the 30-day notice required by the guidelines. There is an inspection that's performed by code enforcement, and that inspection is of the common areas. The park management and the resident representative are asked to go along for the code inspection. And as you know, any violations, health and safety, must be corrected, must be re-inspected, and must be signed off before the park can implement an increase. Also at the resident meeting, the sign-in protest process is discussed. And the residents are told that there is a sign-in sheet in the foyer of the council chambers approximately 30 minutes before the hearing, before the council meeting begins. If they want to protest a short form application, according to the guidelines, they can come and we've set up the sign-in sheet. They can state their objection to the short form. The board, if a majority of the residents who are subject to the rent increase short form application sign in protesting the short form, then the board has the option to deny the short form rent increase. The park may also, at that point, determine whether they want to file a long form, and they have 30 days from the date that the application or the rent increase is denied to notify the city of their intent. It's been several years. There was a situation where there's some issues in the park, and the park accepted a less than 75% increase. There have been one instance in recent years where there was a negotiation between the residents and the park owner. But by and large, in most instances, you will see the 75% being what the park owner will calculate their increase on. And if they are awarded less than 75%, it's not something that needs to be accepted. They have that alternative of filing the long form application. Okay, this concludes the PowerPoint presentation for the Mobile Home Informational Workshop. If there are no questions at this time, I understand that Don Green and Larry Stenick of the Coalition of Escondido Mobile Manufactured Home Voters Political Action Committee have a presentation and would like to address the board.
Sure.
We are certainly happy
Okay.
to answer any questions you may have.
Let's give Don Green and just for clarification, I don't. Are you representing the mobile home park residents, or just to clarify that? Okay. So we will give you 10 minutes presentation for you to share, and then we have also public speakers.
Good evening, Mayor Ebed, Council and staff. My name is Don Green, and I am the president of the Coalition of Escondido Mobile Manufactured Home Voters. In January, I appeared before the council and asked for this workshop. We're very thankful to the council and the staff for the opportunity to present the concerns of the mobile home owners and residents of Escondido. Over the last year and a half that CEMV has been working with mobile homeowners on issues such as rent control, all of the concerns which have been raised generally fall into one of three categories. Those categories are the Rent Review Board's method of determining a fair, just, and reasonable rent increase, the incorporation of all available and overlooked data to make a proper determination of what that fair, just, and reasonable rent increase is, and we're concerned about the future and making the process as easy and as equitable as possible and reducing the frustration that's developed between the mobile homeowners and the Rent Review Board, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in closing. The first topic that we'll talk about is what is a fair, just, and rent reasonable increase. Rent increase hearings are governed by two documents, the Municipal Code, Section 29-104, and the Mobile Home Rent Review Guidelines. In Section 29-104G of the Municipal Code, the Rent Review Board is to determine a rent increase if it's just, fair, and reasonable. The Rent Review Board is named as a quasi-arbitrator between two parties in a contract negotiation. The parameters of that arbitration are clearly defined in the documentation. In 29-104G, there are, as the city attorney alluded to, there are 11 specific areas of consideration that the Rent Review Board can use to determine if a rent increase is just, fair, and reasonable. It's important to note that these 11 areas of consideration are applicable to both the long-form and the short-form rent applications. The difference, the determination between the two is in the direction that the report that staff will prepare for you. The Rent Review Board is not limited to the staff report for its determination in the rent increase. Section 29-104G and Section 12E of the Rent Review Guidelines allow consideration of items such as comparable rents, utility charges, reasonable operating expenses, needs for repair, and, my emphasis, the amount and quality of services provided by the applicant to the affected tenant, and those apply to both forms of the application. In a long-form hearing, staff is charged with preparing a detailed analysis of a proposed rent increase. In the short-form hearing, the staff report, and only the staff report, is limited to code enforcement inspection report and an analysis of the change in the CPI. Section 12E of the Rent Review Guidelines, the Rent Review Board is advised to presume that up to 75% of the change in the CPI is a fair, just, and reasonable rent increase. Again, emphasis is mine. This is a presumption, not a guarantee, not a compromise, and not a rubber stamp. It's important to emphasize here that the presumption that up to 75% is a fair, just, and reasonable rent increase. That does not mean that 35% is less fair or less just or less reasonable. Your presumption is up to 75% being fair, just, and reasonable. Now we'll take a look at some of the information, that we feel has been missing in some of the recent rent hearings. The long-form rent hearing is subject to sections 1 through 11 and section 13 of the Rent Review Guidelines. A short-form rent hearing is subject to sections 10 through 13 of the Rent Review Guidelines, and that's defined in section 12, item A of the Rent Review Guidelines. Over the years, certain applicable sections of the Rent Review Guidelines have been overlooked in this process. For example, sections 10, items A, B, and E have been completely excluded from the hearings. They're not even included in the application process. This information will provide you as the Rent Review Board better information to make a better informed decision about what a fair, just, and reasonable rent increase is. The mobile home park owners understand that the short form was a compromise among the city, park owners, and homeowners. We also understand that the duties and responsibilities of the Rent Review Board under Proposition K cannot be abandoned. Yes, the short form process was developed to reduce costs in litigation, and it streamlines the process and gives all parties an expectation of exactly what a future rent increase might be. But, however, the short form was not designed to lessen the quality of life of mobile homeowners by ignoring the living conditions in parks. In the city's document, which was referred to earlier, Mobile Home Rent Control History, it states that the short-form guidelines, quote, were developed to apply and implement rent increases within the parameters of Proposition K. Notice and public hearings are still required. All of the factors must be considered, my emphasis, but the focus is on CPI. Again, in the short form process, the CPI is looked at and park owner is restricted to only requesting an increase based upon the CPI, but all factors must be considered. 29-104G, those 11 factors must be considered according to our guidelines. For example, the most recent case with Mobile Park West, the amenities and quality of life were not taken into consideration. They were documented in part on the 3.5 pages of code enforcement violations, and yes, there was a continuance ordered, and time was given to the park to make corrections, but the 2 years of the lack of amenities and poor quality of life were not considered. It is clear that if the 11 points of consideration indicated in 29104G had been taken into account and not ignored, then Mobile Park West would have either been denied their rent increase or it would have been reduced. Moving forward. The guidelines for rent increases and hearings are well established and defined. The owners of mobile homes ask only that these guidelines and laws are followed. We have no problem with the short form process. We have no problem with the long form process. We have no problem with anything that's been established. We only want what is written in our books to be followed. It has been remarked in the past that money or the rent increase amount is the subject of the homeowner's protest. This could not be further from the truth. Though finances are always a consideration, the adherence to Prop K and the guidelines by the Rent Review Board far outweighs our concern over our wallet. When parks which are in an unacceptable condition are granted increases because of a general lack of understanding of the guidelines, the level of frustration rises. And when the homeowners know that the Rent Review Board can do a better job, the animosity which you often see develops. If there's one thing that you remember and take away from this presentation, please let it be this. Rent hearings are a review from the date of the last rent increase to the current day. They're not a projection into the future. The code enforcement inspection doesn't predict what the park status is going to be in a year or two, and the application doesn't ask the owner to predict what the next rent increase is going to be. Hearings are a look back over a specific period of time and an analysis of the conditions of the parks during those times. Just like the child that begins to do the advanced math to figure out which day in November or December they have to start being good so Santa will still bring them gifts at Christmas, so does the park owner do when their rent increase starts. They figure out what day that they need to start cleaning up their park because they know that Sam's going to come and drive through and take a look. So they need to know that the place is looking good. And just like that child that has the miraculous conversion to being good, the park owners have no intention of making it a permanent change as long as they know they don't have anyone watching them and holding them accountable. CEMV hopes that after this workshop and the opportunity to hear the concerns of residents outside of a rent increase hearing, the Rent Review Board will better apply the rent review guidelines in Proposition K. Also, we believe that through the better application of the guidelines, the focus of the rent hearings will be more to the matter of two parties negotiating a contractual agreement and less to a homeowner versus rent review board attitude. The process now is such that a park owner will submit an application and sit back and watch the fight between the homeowners and the rent review board. They know that because of the lack of accountability, they can get an approval out of the board with a minimum effort expended. And whether or not it is correct, the perceived latitude and favoritism shown for the park owners spurs the residents' angers towards the Rent Review Board and is manifested in the angry words that you hear from this podium, directed not at park owners, but at you. Proposition K and the Rent Review Guidelines were put into place to protect the rights of the residents of Escondido. Your duties and responsibilities as elected officials are to execute those rules justly. Next. That concludes our presentation. Thank you. And if there are any questions, we'd be happy to answer. We also, since tonight seems to be the night of giving gifts to people, we have some binders to pass out to everyone.
And these binders will have Prop K in it. It will have the rent review guidelines. It will have the mobile home residency law. It will have frequently asked questions about the MRL as prepared and answered by the state of California. And it will have a copy of the presentation. We know that going forward, we will always have this with us so that we can refer to this, and if you guys have it available, that'll be great too. We'll be on the same page going forward.
Right. Thank you, Don and Larry, for the good presentation. I have few speakers right now. Let's take the speakers. First, I have M.A. Manick. Yes, I would like to wait. Okay. Thank you. I have Wayne Love.
Good evening again, Mayor, Council Member. Again, thank you for this workshop. It's been stated that the park owns the land. It's also been stated that the residents come in with these mobile homes, outdated name, plant these homes on this other people's land. Now, when you drive through each of these parks, as these rent increases come up, keep in mind the space directly adjacent. In some cases, there is no common area. The spaces adjacent to these parks, or these mobile homes, under these mobile homes, are maintained only by the residents that live there. So when you go through these mobile home parks and you see that is a beautiful park, ladies and gentlemen of this council, look behind the rose gardens in front of the mobile home. Look at the wires that are hanging out. Look at the cement that is broken. Look at the pavement, the asphalt that's cracked and raised. The residents are not responsible for that. But what you will see are the rose gardens, the beautiful flowers, the well-kept carports within the mobile home residence. Again, look behind. You will see wires. You will see paint chipping. If you look close, you will find that 75% in most of these cases is not fair, is not just, and it is not reasonable. Most of the parks, or the park that I live in, Carefree, when people leave for the grace of God, the families of that resident is out of state in most cases. The rent still keeps on going for that resident that's no longer there. The families basically give it up, walk away. The park owner has a free mobile home. Well, free being maybe $3,000. And in one case in my park, $1. It's sickening. What does he do? If he doesn't like that coach, if it's not up to par, he'll pull it out. And because of the full 75% rent increase that the city council gives that owner, he buys a brand new mobile home, moves it into that space, and charges whatever he wants. God bless you. Stay with us. Good night.
Thank you, Wayne. Jerry Lenhart.
Good evening. My name is Jerry Lenhart. I'm a 34-year resident of Escondido. A couple comments on some of the things Mr. F. said. He gave a real good talk on what mobile home and the background of some of the problems we had. However, there have been no rental parks built in the last 35 years, and there never will be anymore either because of the cost. So they got a monopoly. Everybody should know that. Mr. Epp also talked about ROPs, which I live in, resident-owned parks. He mentioned that they're nonprofit. The indication that I understood was the park owners need more money than a resident-owned park because we own the park and it's nonprofit and all that baloney. I pay $147 a month, and that includes sewer, water, and trash. There's a park across the street from me, Moonglow. In my opinion, it's a dump. It's a family park. Take a ride through there. New people in there pay $750. He mentioned tonight the Oceanside having a meeting. I was asked to speak there tonight, but I wanted to come here to see what's going on here. I also got calls from up in Capitola, Thousand Oaks, and several other cities up north. AARP is putting on AARP. The Park Owners Association, WMA, statewide is putting on a campaign. Instead of going to try to get rid of rent control like they have tried in the last 3 or 4 elections, this time, because of Jerry Brown being the governor, they figure he's going to veto anything, so they're concentrating locally. So I can only assume that some of you have been contacted by WMA to bring up these kinds of things and try to put them in, make their case. The vacancy control, that was lost in the Thompson case, as Mr. Epp said. My understanding was from Mr. Epp himself, the week it was lost. Their argument, the city's argument, our city's argument was not that we had vacancy control. It was that the park owner paid too much. And then at the last minute, they brought in the vacancy control and they felt like they were losing. And the appellate court said, no, you can't bring that in. You made your argument that the park owner had paid too much. So that's why we lost. I assume, Michelle talked about different parks. The park owners, in the sign-in sheet, she talked about we need a majority of the residents. That's not true. We proved that several times when June Rady was on the council. There's nobody in this city hall that attended any of those meetings except me, and I was at every single one of them. And nobody in City Hall knows about Prop K except the residents, because we did it all by ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, council discussion. Let's start with council.
I'll take my turn now.
Okay, go ahead.
My name is Marek.
Okay.
Anyway, it's Mareck. I'm sorry if my handwriting is for school teacher. It should perhaps be even better. Anyway, I just wanted to say that what I've heard tonight presented in basically the folders that the binders that were given to City Council, I think that's great, because you folks now, you have the lives of these people who live basically in the rental homes, Mayor. You have their lives in your hands. And you will have the information you need. And the other factor that I would mention would simply be that it seems very obvious to me that Prop K, the 11 factors, are always the basic things that must be considered, and there is no one factor that would make a decision in any particular case. And I think, well, are you still here? The 11 factors are in there. Yeah, the whole Prop K is in there, and the 11 factors are there. So, and last of all, I would say that that's the content I want to touch upon, is Prop K and the 11 factors, and that you folks now have what you need, which is great. And I do understand, I think to a great extent, the amount of work that you have if you actually do your homework. There's a tremendous amount. And so this really helps it. The last thing is that I was rather, I don't know, I don't even know the right adjective. And like I said, I'm a school teacher. But in past rent hearings when I have been here, I have become very much aware of something, more intensely aware of a fact I intellectually realized, and that is that a lot of the people, a majority, an overwhelming majority probably, of the people who are residents in rental parks are of an advanced age. And for them to ask that a majority of them actually get here to these chambers and then, get themselves down here, that there must be a majority of them show up if they protest, if they feel that the short form process did not really tell the picture, tell the facts the way they are in where they reside. I feel that I assume, Mr. Epp, I do assume that there is a procedure or a vote or something that the council could do or you could do to advise them. It is not necessary that we have that provision, that these elderly and respected people in our community be required to do something which is really oftentimes beyond their capacity at this point in their life. And that does not mean they are not mentally capable. And
Thank you.
Okay, so that's my comment. I would hope that the council would really use those binders to consider the facts of the situation, and that we do something, Mayor Abad, please, to make sure that we are not making an unethical requirement of our elderly citizens. There's no reason why that couldn't be done if you have these meetings at the
Thank
at
you.
the park.
We appreciate it.
people.
I have to respect the time issue for
I understand that, Mayor,
everybody.
and I will conclude by saying that I don't feel that I really I do not feel that there is a level of respect on your part for often I see people not really, and you among them, not listening to what people have to say. Not me. I'm not worried about it.
I appreciate
but
it.
I wish you would actually listen and take it in.
Okay, I appreciate it. I think let me just address that. I appreciate it.
I will sit down.
Thank you very much. The time limit is a respect to everybody to have equal treatment. Otherwise, it would be a judgment call from the mayor here to pick and choose who can take more time and less time. It's a fairness issue. I think we have to apply it equally, and I think that would be the best way to be fair and equitable to everyone. Otherwise, it will be difficult to say when can you exceed the red light by 10 seconds or 1 minute or 3 minutes, and that's why I think this is the fair issue for us, and we would like to listen to more people within this 2 minutes or 3 minutes time frame. It's not a disrespect, ma'am. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I know. I'm listening. Yeah, and we have. You cannot talk. We cannot go back and forth. Your time is up. We cannot go back and forth. Okay. So it's just when we get through the process, we would like to hear as many people as we can. Right now, we still have about 4 or 5 people that we couldn't hear. So if we give more time to the people and allow to exceed the limits, then other people will not have the chance to speak. So we have to stick to that. Every government meetings uses that, and we have to be effective and give everybody a chance to speak and address the council. So right now, we bring it back to the council discussion. We'll start with Olga.
I have a question that I had never thought of before, but when Jeff was giving his presentation, you mentioned that Oceanside could deal with vacancy decontrol by city ordinance, and that the reason we cannot is because we have rent control by initiative. And it had never occurred to me that we can have an ordinance for vacancy control. Did I understand correctly that we have that authority?
No, actually, it's the opposite. You do not.
Okay, but they do.
Right. In California, there's 2 ways a city can adopt a law. One way is for the city council to do it. The other way is for the voters to do it. It's the same thing as with the initiatives at the state level. In Escondido, if you talk to folks like Jerry Lenhard and others who were involved in the history, the city council did not or declined opportunities to do a rent control ordinance for a number of years. And then finally in 1988, the residents got together and circulated an initiative forced it to be placed on the ballot. It was placed on the ballot and it passed. So therefore, the city is bound by that law adopted by the people. It can only be amended or changed by another vote of the people. So that it's a mechanism to prevent the city council from stepping in and changing what the people have decreed directly. And so my understanding in Oceanside is that their rent control ordinance was adopted by their city council, so future city councils have the right to change it. We don't have the ability to do that here in Escondido because ours was adopted by the people.
But ours, it might be splitting hairs, but I thought I understood that it was determined that our Prop K language is not a vacancy control initiative.
Right.
Right. No, we are not a vacancy control. So there is vacancy decontrol.
Right.
So really, we haven't touched the item. It seems to me that, it's a rent control only, but not a decontrol issue. So it's a separate issue that we could.
Well, whether you adopt it, whether the people adopt it or the council adopt it, you're still bound by the decisions of the court interpreting it. And in this case, the court interpreted the people's law by saying it does not contain this. So to have it contain vacancy control, you'd have to amend it. You'd have to go back to the people.
Okay.
That's how that works.
So I guess one of the reasons that particular topic I'm sensitive to is because it seems like theft when you have somebody who owns a unit, who's under rent control, who passes away or just wants to move away, that ultimately for every dollar that their rent goes up, their personal property, which is the unit, that value goes down. So in essence, the park owner is robbing the equity of the mobile unit owner. And that seems so unfair to me, just, regardless of whether I'm on this council or not, that idea, that notion seems unfair to me, and that there's got to be some way to balance that. Now, I understand that mobile parks are not, there are no new mobile parks, and I think Jerry said it's been 30-something years since one was initiated. I hear that they're very profitable, and I'm sure that's nice for the owner, but I also recognize that the parks that we have, at least in our city, the ones I'm familiar with, serve an affordable housing kind of a function. They also are the most affordable housing we can find for some of our seniors. And that anytime we're talking about money, we really have to be more sensitive to their ownership rights. And it seems that we've heavily leaned toward the property owners as opposed to the residents. They both own something, so it's hard to describe it correctly. But I don't ever feel good about raising somebody's rent $5 when I know that means they're not going to make ends meet because they're already struggling. And conversely, I really don't like it when park owners feel entitled to a rent increase when they haven't really provided the service. So one of the things I really liked about CEMV's presentation, and Mr. Epp, if you could clarify, that according to CEMV, when we grant a rent increase, we're granting it based on past performance, not future performance, I guess. And that to me seems like the most important part of what we consider when we're looking at a rent increase, because we have had examples of parks that don't do their best by their residents, and yet they expect an increase, and they typically get an increase. So is it true? Are we looking back, or is the park owner entitled just because he applied?
I think generally that their observation's a correct one. See, the difficulty with looking to the future then is if a court were to scrutinize your conduct, you're essentially saying to the court, well, we're predicting what we think might happen in the future, and that's how we're making our decisions. So to some extent, it's an uphill battle to try and base a rent increase decision on the future. You have to look at the snapshot. That's the evidence, essentially, you have in front of you. There's really no hard evidence you would ever have in front of you as to the future. So for that reason, I generally agree with their observation.
We have had mobile park managers come forward and say, well, this year we invested this much in the park, and next year, and they sort of present those predictions of their investment as a reason we should give them an increase, and that always kind of seems a little odd. So anyway, I think that'll be the foundation of rent increase hearings for me from now on, is to see whether the park owner deserved it, earned it, not just 30 or 60 days before they had to come before this board, but whether they were consistent in their providing of a service to the people that live in the park. I think that seems important to me. If the residents wanted to amend their Prop K ordinance, what exactly would they have to do?
There's two ways to get an initiative amendment on the ballot. One way is to circulate the petition and get the required number of signatures. That's based on the number of registered voters in the community. The other way is to get the city council, which has the authority to place a measure on the ballot, and have the city council do it. My recollection is both of the times they attempted to, everybody attempted to put vacancy control on the ballot, they prevailed on the city council to put it on. And the council did in both cases honor that request, put it on the ballot, and then from there it was voted on.
Okay. All right. Well, I think it was great to get the history from both Mr. Epp, because you've been here that long, even though you don't look it, and from Jerry Lenhart, who was in a lot of those meetings to design the short form. It's still always a very touchy issue for me, but I think the general understanding I have from residents is that fair is fair. It's not that they're always begrudging the increase, but they want value for that increase. And there have been examples of when they accepted that rent increases because they thought that it was worth it, and others when that's simply not the case. And so I think what we need to demonstrate as a board is that we can be objective, that we don't rubber stamp, because we are criticized for that. Pretty much any rent review hearing that comes before us gets approved eventually, and quite easily, actually. So we do need to be more mindful of being balanced about that. So anyway, thanks for all of the work that you did to put the presentation together, both City Attorney and Michelle and CEMV.
Just one quick comment. I just want to also thank Ronnie Kaiser and Michelle Henderson for putting together a great book as well. That was very, very informative for me and helped get me up to date so I could understand what everyone was talking about tonight. So it was very, very helpful, and appreciate that.
Okay. Well, okay, go ahead.
Well, I just want to say it was interesting to take that look back, because I actually sat through all of those rent hearings back in 1988 all the way through 95. So I remember a lot of the long forms and coming back over and over and over with the rent hearings. The short form has definitely streamlined the process. It hasn't solved all the problems by far, but it helps us, focus, I think, on some of the issues. But one of the things that I grapple with, and I think we all grapple with, is trying to discern what's really an issue that the council can look at versus what's something between the residents and the park owner. I mean, there's some issues that I don't know that the city can really be, nor should it be, involved in. And that's where, those guidelines, the 11 points, it still isn't totally clear. So it's case by case as it comes up, and I think that's something that I struggle with. So,
Councilmember Gallo?
Okay.
Yeah. I just want to remind folks that a couple months ago when I asked to have us review the draft, Councilmember Diaz brought up the fact that, well, if we're going to do that, then let's review Prop K. So thank you for doing it. I agreed to that. This is very informative, and I do have a question. Section 12, some talk has been made about the 11 points that we should consider. Need some clarification. The board shall consider the short form application at a public hearing. The staff report will not contain analysis of any of the factors required by Section 29-104G, which is the 11 points of consideration for a rent increase application of the rent protection ordinance, other than the change in CPI. In determining whether the amount of the park owner's requested increase is appropriate, the board must presume that up to 75% of the consumer price index is a fair, just, and reasonable rent increase. However, the board may, doesn't say must or shall, may consider any of the other ordinance factors at the request of either the park owner or the affected residents in determining that a lesser increase is fair, just, and reasonable. So, do we consider the 11 factors, or don't we?
Ma'am, you cannot speak from the...
I've tried to think of a good way to address that, because while I was listening to Mr. Green's presentation, what he said is accurate. Here's a clever analogy, if you will. If you have a table, the mobile home rent control ordinance requires all 11 factors to be sitting on the table. Which one of those menu items you choose to eat is up to you. What the short form does is focuses on one of those and says they've all got to be on the table. You've got to have them on the table to honor Prop K. But the short form focuses on one of those. So it doesn't prohibit the other ones from being there, but guides you to focus on that one.
Well, that's my point.
Yeah.
This says
It says the staff report, so Michelle only focuses on the CPI.
will not contain analysis, it will only focus on the CPI.
Her,
And
but
then the
we
last-
have to do it
but
all.
But the last sentence of Section 12E states that the board may.
Right.
So
That's
we
because
have to.
under Prop K, you could not legally constrain yourself not to consider something in Prop K.
Right.
So the 11 factors are in there, so the city doesn't have, the council, the staff doesn't have the legal ability to prevent the council from considering factors, I think is why.
And let me just add some other stuff. I've said this before, and other council members who served with me in the past have said that, you know, the owner runs a business, and the mobile park residents are his customers. And aside from health and safety issues, which our housing department is concerned about, it's pretty much up to him whether he wants to have blue paint on the buildings or red or purple or green, whether he wants to satisfy the tenants in some respect. As long as the park is in a safe condition, that the people are not in jeopardy health-wise, et cetera, the amenities that the owner provides, it's just like any condominium project. There are some condominium projects that are much nicer than others. Not all of them are really nice. Okay? I'm not going to name any, but there are a few in town that are still, in my estimation, subpar. But they're condominium complexes and their ownership. And how they end up that way, I really don't know. But
We don't have any discretion over the,
no, I understand, but I'm saying that the ownership of the condominium projects is the homeowners association, which are the condo owners themselves. They own it themselves, and yet they let the places deteriorate. But it's up to them to decide whether they want to have really spiffy things, they want to have a nice Olympic pool, or a sauna, or a weight room, or all these kind of amenities. And, you know, I always look at it as like the owner, and if the owner wants to drive his tenants out, that's his problem. I mean, he's going to suffer the consequences.
that's the issue, though. He can't drive his tenants out because they can't take their home with them. I mean, I think that...
No, I understand that part. I mean, I really do. Okay, but our concern as a am I getting out of line here or what? Okay. I mean, we're supposed to be discussing Prop K, but as long as the park is decent, and I agree with Moonglow, but see, they don't never come before us for rent control, right? That's one park that we've never seen. At least I've never seen it.
I have a question.
The last time they came before the board was 2003.
2000. Oh, I remember that one. Yeah, with the handicap rail. But that was the last time because they don't want to be participating. And that owner there, I don't know. I don't know about them. But anyway, my question was about Section 12 here, what it said, as opposed to what the beginning portion of Prop K said.
So Michelle just focuses on the CPI because that's what the short form says she has to do, but we can always bring up the rest of them.
Right.
But a good point, actually a question I have now that from listening to Ed, is you talk about a property owner, a park owner as a businessman providing, you know, services that the client want and that the client is the resident. But I've never seen that the residents have an option to ask for anything. In other words, they're treated as though they just have to accept, the pool is heated or it's not. The laundry facilities have old units in them. I mean, that's not like the residents ever request or have an option to request better services.
Well, I remember a park, I can't remember which one it was now, a couple of them where they wanted amenities for kids, and eventually they were put in.
That part, I
things
agree.
like that.
In fact, I brought that
remember.
up years ago. I said we've had so many parks that are all age parks now that some of them were. Well, Eastwood Meadows was one. The Flip Flop, there was all age. It was a family park. Then it was a senior park. Then it was a family park. These places have kids, and there's no places for the kids to play. Mm-hmm. They have no playgrounds there. And I've always stated that they should be required to put in playground equipment for the kids, because it used to be a senior park. Now it's all age. Mm-hmm. Because years ago we had, out of the 29 parks, I don't know, we must have had half of them might have been senior parks, because this was the history of Escondido. Is we had all the snowbirds come down from Idaho and Montana, and maybe some from Wyoming, and Washington State, and winter in Escondido from November to April, and that's why we had a lot of the senior parks. I mean, I've been here since '73, and I pick up all this stuff. So, but since then, now we only have, 5 senior parks? I think it's 5. Okay? So a lot of the senior parks didn't have, seniors don't go on play swings and sliding boards. So those amenities were not there. And I think an owner of a park that's a family park today should put those in there.
But I think the idea is they don't have to compete.
Put in a pool too? You can require them to put in a pool?
If there's no, that's a good amenity to have. I wouldn't say they have to have a pool, but playground equipment.
But where do you stop it?
Well, a family park should have playground equipment for the kids. I mean, as an owner, don't you think that you should provide a playground for the kids? They have room.
But we don't ever ask them to do
I know, we
anything
never
like
do
that.
that, but maybe we should.
I think, are you done, Councilman?
Yeah.
Okay. Councilmember? Okay. I want to thank everybody for this workshop. Basically, what started this workshop is our rent control hearing and the short form hearings. A lot of information, a lot of misinformation, a lot of statements made. And Councilmember Diaz suggested, well, let's have a workshop. Let's talk about these issues. And after the election, I met with Don Greeny and Larry Stanek, and they asked for this workshop. So I said, and Olga will sponsor that. We did not get calls from anybody, and it's initiated by us, the council. We wanted to clarify that this is an important issue for the community. We have thousands of people living in this, and I appreciate City Attorney Jeff App. That's the longest time I hear him speak, and he did a good job in doing that. I'm glad he's not charging us by hour. So
good. The guy argued in the Supreme Court, yes, for crying out loud.
But this is really, as Olga said, he has the best perspective about this because he has been with this for a long time, and I'm glad we have had more information. We learned more about it today and the history of the mobile home park things. But I think the most significant issue for me is the progress we have made over the years. I've been here 24 years, and I can tell you most of the mobile home parks 15, 20 years ago were not in a good shape. The majority of them were not. Only very few were good mobile home parks and were good places to live. I think after 15, 20 years, I think we have made a lot of progress. I think most of the mobile home park now are a good, much better places, much better maintained and everything else. But one basic issue is, I understand that this issue is evolving from a long time ago when the trailers are easily moved, and now to the mobility of the mobile home park that Jeff indicated. And it is a valid argument that it's hard to move the mobile home park, and if you're not happy with the arrangements, it's very hard for you to move. It's a valid concern. You have less choices, but you choose to go into this situation, and you are aware that you might get into this situation. But certainly it is an issue. I think this is also have to be weighed in against the property rights. I think property rights also have to be respected, but it's a tough one when you consider the Proposition K and the restrictions and everything else. And it's not an easy decision for us. I personally thought that the 75% of the CPI is a reasonable increase, considering that the mobile home parks continue to improve. We have made cases with a lot of issues that we have turned down at the increase or send it back to correct some issues. By law, Proposition K is here, and that's what we have to make decision on Proposition K. Health and safety issues and the 11, criteria that we have to make. We would like to go up there and look at the tenant and fairness issue and the landlord-tenant issues that I continue to use. This is hard for us to go to that level. While we would like to be there, we are obligated by law to make a decision on the increase based on the Proposition K, whether we agree on it or not. But we're pushing that level of accountability as much as we can, and I think we have made a difference in pushing the mobile home park owners to do more and more and more, and hopefully we will continue in that direction. I think we have made progress. I think the mobile home park owners have been a better place than before, but more importantly, it's good to continue this dialogue, this discussion, talk about it, have different views. And I appreciate Don and Larry, you have focused on the issues today and you have made your emphasis. And this book, by the way, is available on our website with the mobile home park rent control, the entire ordinance. Not all of it, but the basic ordinance is there. But it's a good information to have. We understand your emphasis. We have stated our positions on this. But I think working together, it will always be a good thing to build that trust, continue the dialogue, talk about the issues versus just going head to head and this. And I appreciate this. I think we'll probably have put our relationship in a better light, and I think we would like to continue this dialogue, talk about these issues, and you know that you can always call me or any council members would love to continue this dialogue and talk about it. So we appreciate it. I think it's good. We fulfill our promise to you, and it's not going to be the last meeting we talk about Proposition K. Maybe we should do it every year. Put it and talk about it, and let's discuss the issues in ways where we can continue to make progress. I think the goal is to make the mobile home park a better living environment for the residents, and I think we have to put pressure on the mobile home park owners as well to do the things that they should do. We are evolving from a senior place and an older people to a family situation where we have to provide amenities and everything. A lot of them are. Some of them, it continues to be a challenge to address the basic things, but we'll continue to put pressure to make sure that when we are going to give them the 75% of the CPI, we want to make sure that they provide they address the issues over and above the health and safety issues.
Just one final comment. I can tell you from a personal perspective, having been in the real estate business and selling mobile homes in various parks throughout the city, that the mobile home parks, since Prop K actually, they are in infinitely better condition today than they were 25 years ago. They're cleaner. They're the driveways, the roadways, etc., are in better condition. Because I can remember, I won't give you personal anecdotes, but because Olga gets upset when I take too much time. But trust me, the parks in Escondido are probably some of the nicest parks, and I've heard this comment from people coming from out of the area who looked at mobile homes in other cities. And they said the parks in this town are really nice.
Okay.
So that's
Well,
personal
thank you.
observation.
Well, good discussion.
I agree that we should have this discussion more frequently, though, because it's the first time in 20 years or something. So we
Absolutely.
every time the council turns over,
Sure.
every year or two, I think it's important. And actually, I'm surprised we didn't have any park owners represented. Did they write? Did they call?
I think they have been contacted. They choose not to come. This is not about the mobile home park owners. This is about
No, but they need to understand the same thing that the residents understand, because they do feel entitled to that 75% of CPI as though it's theirs. And so I would have hoped that they had some representation. And if anything, we should make it required that they watch this session online before they apply for another rent increase.
Well, they have been invited, so.
I got to tell you, the libertarian in me, my hair is standing on end listening to you two. You know? It's just that I don't know where you guys are coming from right now.
I know. Yeah, okay. Well, we appreciate it. Thank you very